of the world that becomes more and more of a problem because precisely of social change and because of you know, well, the typical case in Africa of the conflict between pastoral communities and agricultural communities, which is a lot around water as well, but which is a conflict that has been growing and growing and continues to grow, essentially because of the economic system and because of how the governments behave in relation to that. Because for them, normally, in many countries in Africa, it's more important to promote the conversion to agriculture than staying in pastoral economies. So that's a conflict, situation of conflict that in Africa is very important, will probably continue to grow, particularly in some parts of Africa, but also with changes in rainfall patterns and all that, and more drought.
Yeah, Gonzalo, I'm a bit more skeptic about what you say, because I think very often community-based natural resources management, although the principle is all right, because you have to empower people about their own resources, if you, the emphasis you put on traditions, I think that's something you're going to lose the battle. If I look at the countries where I come from, I see populations doubling, tripling in my lifetime already. I see those communities that have done proper community management now being overflooded by immigrants coming in because there's something to reap in that area. If I see cascading of disasters because of refugees that are installing and as locusts depleting the resources of their neighbors, those things you cannot answer with community-based natural resource management. Communities cannot cope with those things, if you ask me. And so I think we have to design ways of still empowering the local people, but to answer these challenges of modern times. And that's why I don't get that feeling if I listen to you. Sorry to say so.
Well, maybe it's a question of emphasis, and probably it's a question as well of definitions, if you want. Because when I speak of traditions, I don't speak necessarily about old ways of doing things in all times. I talk more about the cultural context of a given community practicing things that they have learned from the past and that work still today. And these communities being able to learn, but also considering their own cultural context. It's like, you know, you may have learned from your mother to cook traditional dishes from your own culture, and you may cook them today, but using different instruments. But still, you have a tradition with you. And that tradition makes a very important part of your culture. I am sure you're interested as well in transmitting that to your children and keeping a family, a community that maintains some of those traditions, but also with innovation. So keeping all that we can bring from the past and still works and makes, you know, the fabric of the community. That's essentially what tradition is. It's not keeping to the old practices of all times, because that is impossible and will not work. Innovation is absolutely indispensable. Science, modern technology, they are all absolutely indispensable. But you see today you have many very interesting projects, very useful projects of traditional communities, of hunters, for example, who are using GPS today, you know, to put on a map their traditional ways of tracing game in the forest, because, you know, by putting that on the map, it can be more easily transmitted to the younger generations. But they are still using a lot of their traditional understanding of how these things work in the forest. So again, it's not a question of just keeping the old practices of the past, but it's a question of not necessarily dropping everything from your culture just because it's something that comes from your ancestors, because there might be many things useful, from that traditional knowledge that can be still used today.
All right. It's not all black and white, right? There are many issues, trade-offs, modern, traditional. Are there any other comments or questions, Jonathan?
I was just thinking about Pete's comments and then Gonzalo's response, and I think maybe there are a lot of limitations to community-based approaches, but I think the other thing is we have to consider the realistic alternatives. So, for example, in Thailand at the moment, if you didn't promote community participation, I think you'd be left with a lot of government responses which are often not very, very just. Or you'd be left with a lot of private sector responses which aren't very appropriate. So, for example, IWRM in Thailand, one of the biggest obstacles is private sector companies that funnel a lot of the water off into the industrial sector, making it impossible to do integrated water management. Or, for example, if you're looking at the resilience of communities, Gonzalo talked about one of the important issues being rights. We have forest dwellers, agricultural communities who've encroached on forest in Thailand, being fined millions of baht. So a farmer who earns maybe 10 or 20,000 baht a year, being fined 1 million baht for loss of ecosystem services because he encroached on the forest. So while I agree with some of Pete's observations that sometimes community-based approaches have their limitations and you have to be addressing things on a wider scale, but at least promoting grassroots participation is a break to some of these other potentially more dangerous problems as well. If we had really good, benevolent states that were going to look after the population, if we had really sort of generous private sectors who were going to do really, really good things and not just look after their own shareholders, then maybe we wouldn't need to have such an emphasis on community-based approaches. But I don't think, certainly in Southeast Asia, I don't think the world is such a nice place yet.
But what happens in a disaster? Who's the first to be there to help their neighbors? It's the community. And they often, they might be isolated for days or weeks, right? And so they have to have that capacity, even if not everything is perfectly rosy in a community. It's not a perfect place. But they're the first to be there on site and the first that need to also do the prevention work. So we cannot rely on government always to come to our rescue, right? And so that's where resilience is created, is from the bottom up, but also some top-down help from government as well. So I think this is actually, is there one last thing we're going to, one last question?
Something we can call it technology transfer. Usually, as you said, you cannot really government all the time and just in our research, we did some research and we transfer this directly to the farmers, solving a lot of problems in this regard, conserving a lot of indigenous land, for example, just by, for example, we are facing the problem of salinity, drought, and we are introducing some variety that can cope with those two problems. We do it in our research station in different places or regions around the country, and then after that we just give it to the farmers that this is a solution for some. We can move this variety, we can have that one. We have a lot of course research that he may ask you about the nutritional value for some grasses. He will ask about the amount of water requirement, about the fertilizer. We did all of these things in our research stations in all regions, and take concern of whatever the farmers can ask, did some research, and then go to the farmers with this kind of information, with this kind of variety, trying to solve the problem. We call it as a technology transfer.
Okay. So you're talking about communication between scientists, local people, and the communication tools. And actually, this is a really good introduction to what we'll talk about after the coffee break. which will be the vulnerability and community capacity assessment of communities, and actually how you do that. A concrete example given from Thailand as a means of communication. And then we'll have a presentation from Iman Melian, who just came in from the Nature Conservancy, which is another tool that can be used for communicating risks. And we will conclude the day. You're going to actually draw your own maps of some of your own project site in group. As maps is a really good tool. It can be a basic tool. I've done this with illiterate farmers in Nepal, of communicating their risks, and a way of communicating with geologists about how we can reduce those risks. So we're going to talk about concrete tools for communicating risks and for finding concrete solutions. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Gonzalo and James, for joining us. Thank you very much. What I would like you to do now is I'd like to invite you to hang up your posters, whatever you're able to finish.
I have to leave.
Yes, you do. I know. You have to. Gonzalo has a full-day workshop that took time out to come here today, so grateful for that. I'm going to invite you to hang up your posters, go out and get some tea and coffee, and come back, and we can have informal discussion about what you came up with, and then we will invite Jonathan to come up and talk to us about this concrete tool for assessing community vulnerability. So please hang up your posters and go. I think we're allowed to bring in coffee and tea. I hope they don't get angry at us. So please, you can bring it in here. Right?
I never said that I'm against participation.
No,
or community
no, but
based
it's but it's a good point, because sometimes we make it out to be perfect communities, all rosy, it's the solution to everything. I was glad you brought the point, because I was hoping this would. So it was somebody needs to devil's advocate, but that was perfect. Thank you.
Oh my god, and like 18 of these tiles are drummers. But when you ask, they give you the big one.
Oh, do they? Oh, I haven't asked. I've supplied.
But we don't have a one for them. Ours is at the door.
Yeah, no.
So I've got all my clothes.
No wardrobe and no.
It's just, well, there is a laundry, you just have to do it yourself.
Talk all the time tomorrow.
Just do it at home. Spoiled. Okay, so you know you do the whole rest of the comments? Tomorrow?
No. What time's that?
What time will you come back in? Let's have a couple of meetings.
For the next 2-3 months during the drought season, so that will solve the problem. The other thing is related to problem of migration of people from upstream to downstream. That can be controlled when you have in those areas try to make agroforestry, so people they can have their livelihood in the same area as well as maintain ecosystem and also prevent falling of water and erosion, soil erosion. So this will prevent people migrating downhill and improve their livelihood. But the system here, what we're suggesting, it must be theoretical clean, as it was mentioned here. If you have a system and that do not allow accumulation of erosion or soil erosion from those dams or streams, that will make a disaster with floods. So this should be theoretical, should be clean, and proper water movement in those channels and the rivers and artificial channels. That will prevent disaster. So people now they can stay on the same area that they're staying now without any disaster. So we think that about say about 1.5 million or 1.6 million should be spent on this infrastructure.
Million. They only got
1.6
They
million.
only got 2 million, right? So.
I know it's not, but in Nepal you can make that. I know. Well, I visited Nepal, and building dams is quite cheap, and maybe you can have a sort of infrastructure that can control.
Okay.
And some of the, say, couple of thousand, you have to make sustainable economy in those areas, so prevent people coming down. So we
This is
thought
a different approach, huh? This is more of a
Yeah.
structural approach.
yeah, as well as social economic approach.
Okay, an
together.
economical approach. Any comments on the dam?
Is it
Tears?
physically possible? Well, group 2 can't comment because they probably have proposed the same.
Okay, well, we'll wait for some of the. So that's interesting. It's a very different approach, huh? That's interesting. So,
But of course, when in the middle of the project, you have to find some funding.
okay, there's some more funding. Okay.
That is 100%.
So in Nepal, we also have many half-built projects that are sitting there.
They need
Steam wells
some
also.
extra dollars of that money because they know it's enough. Yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the issues with building a dam that James mentioned? Trade-offs, right?
Well, you control
Yeah.
water movement as well as storage for the future
Yeah.
during drought season. But this has to be technology should be,
Yeah.
prevent or it should be controlled in terms of movement.
So we have some. This is probably ecological issues. It could be some ecological issues, but I understand the desire to control the river. However, in 2008, there's a huge dam on the Koshi River, which is a little bit 10 kilometers west, and
Same
it's
area?
same area, and
So
it ruptured in 2008 due to not cleaning the silt. That
Yeah,
there's
this is
high
what we said.
siltation rates, and it killed 58,000 people in
That
Nepal
is-
and flooded 3 million people
That is
in India.
management problem.
It was a management problem.
Yeah, that's it.
So there's ongoing cost to managing after many years. So trade-offs here, huh? Very interesting. We won't spend too much time, unfortunately, but your
Thank
ideas
you.
are really interesting. Thank you. This group here?
Basically, you notice it's not very ecologically environment focused. It's because we decided the problem was not anthropogenic, and it's not that the community had gone and clogged up the drainage and cut down the trees. It was that they're actually living in a place where the natural flows were. So our first priority was to move the people out. And we know that this didn't work previously, but we think that with our solutions, it can work again. And this is by renovating the existing housing that's already there, but this time giving the community ownership. So our intention is to renovate it so that this housing provides what the community wants, not what we think they need. So we plan to have a very intensive community consultation session, making sure that, they want waste management, they want drinking water, they want proximity to education, jobs, and health services. But these are the things that we're going to ensure are provided within this new community that we are creating for them. As another part of giving them this ownership, we're also going to consult with them about allocating the housing based on their communities. So if they were living in these little community groups within this area, we're not then going to move them into these apartment blocks and keep them all separated. So your neighbors or the people that you do business with are still going to be able to be close to you, keeping that cohesion together. The other part of the ownership is that there have been a lot of studies around the psychology of things, that if you give someone something for free, they don't value it as much as if they've had to work for it. So instead of just opening the doors and saying, come in everybody, take a room, it's yours, knock yourself out, we actually plan to sell these flats at a highly subsidized rate and perhaps have a bit of a link. I know these people don't have a lot of money, but have links with our other parts, which you'll see here, about keeping them there and making sure they don't return by providing them with technical training, microfinancing. So part of buying this flat might be that they have to commit to going through this training and undertaking it and bettering their lives. So technical training, we realize, is a medium to long-term solution. We can't expect to say, we're going to give you a skill, you're going to have it tomorrow, you can start your new business. So in the meantime, as a short-term solution, we know that this housing is several kilometers away from where they have lived and done business. We'll provide a bus link that every morning takes them to the area where they previously lived, takes them back at the end of the day. And that way, whatever it is they were doing there, they can continue doing while they're working on a more long-term solution for their lives. Okay? And we'll go to 3 first, I think. Another way to make sure that people don't return to this area is we plan to